Good morning, everybody. You can hear me okay? Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you all for sharing part of your day with me. I know we have people in from Hawaii where it's very early and Australia where it's very late. So thank you for your bravery. And I'm going to try to present my mother here for you. It's really tough job to do in such a short time. Elisabeth did an incredible number of things, and so I'm going to try to boil it down. I'm just going to touch upon some of these things that other speakers are going to talk about at length later in the next few months. So Rodrigo, are you still there? I guess we lost him.
Okay. No.
Yeah. Oh, what time do you want me to finish today?
You have 1 hour and 15 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. I'm Swiss, so I need to know the time. Okay, so let's get started. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. Elisabeth was, I'm biased, of course, but she was an amazing mother, an amazing humanitarian. And unfortunately, with the press, a lot of people kind of understand Elisabeth to basically have written one book about 5 stages. And, as her son, that frustrates me greatly because this woman was nonstop, just constantly trying to help dying patients and right any wrong she saw in the world. So, for example, like people think of her as, an author or a hospice pioneer, but just imagine that she began her work when she was basically about 40 years old working with dying patients, and she retired in her 60s. So in this very short time, she wrote 24 books on death and dying. She lectured around the world. She was a doctor who saw patients. She never charged a patient in her life. She was a hospice pioneer. She was a mother. She ran a fully functioning farm. She actually cooked for the workshops. She did AIDS projects, vet projects, prison projects, workshops, developed palliative care, and she still had time to relax. I don't know how, but this woman was nonstop for almost 30 years. So let's start with her first book on death and dying. The book was an international sensation, as you may know. The book was translated into 37 languages. A few of the languages are here. One thing I'd like to point out is that you see on every single book cover, they haven't bothered to mention that she's a doctor. Just incredible, just so disrespectful because she's a woman. If it was a man, you would see doctor there or MD or something, but because she's a woman, even now, 50 years later, you don't see it. The New York Public Library named her first book one of the books of the century, right next to Freud and the Holy Bible, Revised Version, Timothy Leary, and Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. So wonderful company to be in. Time magazine named Elisabeth one of the 100 most influential people of the century in the scientists and thinkers category. She was listed under the category of unsung heroes, which I think is probably appropriate because she was always being attacked in the press. Even just for working with dying people, she was attacked. Doctors would spit on her in the hallways. People would leave her nasty notes saying, how dare she talk to dying patients? But, Elisabeth always was trying to do the right thing and nothing would stop her. If you can imagine, over her lifetime, she almost died a few times. She had her house burnt down twice. She more or less lost her family because my parents split up because she was traveling so much. She was attacked in the press every week, and yet nothing would slow her down. She didn't care about publicity. She didn't care about her ego. She just wanted to help people. And, that was wonderful in some ways and probably hurt her reputation in some ways. But, she did her work and she did it well. So a lot of people don't know this. There was another on death and dying that came out in the 50s. It was called The Meaning of Death. And if you look at some of the content here, the way it's written, death is the great mystery and excels in controversial associations, several of which have already been encountered. So this kind of language was okay for scholars, but it didn't appeal to the public. And Elisabeth's real gift, I think, is that she was able to build this bridge between common people or patients and the medical community. That was a big problem, as Elisabeth saw it, because there was no bridge of communication of vocabulary. And so Elisabeth did this book with the 5 stages. And, you know, the people loved her, but the critics did not like her because they said it was too simple. And Elisabeth would say, that's my whole point. I'm making it simple so people can understand it, remember it. But of course, the critics didn't like that. A lot of people mistakenly think Elisabeth got her stage theory from other grief workers or other doctors. The stage theory is actually from Anna Freud. They were both associates because they both had Germanic background. And so my mother took her famous stage theory from a Freud, which is very surprising because my mother was a Jungian psychiatrist. And so for her to get her biggest idea from a Freud was very ironic. Something a lot of people don't know is that in On Death and Dying, there was a 13th chapter about life after death and near-death experiences. Unfortunately, the publisher and her best friend both thought it was far too controversial. And so they both pleaded with her to take it out. And so reluctantly she did, but she was always sorry she did. And a lot of people think she began her work with life after death in the late 70s, but actually it began in the 60s. She was just not allowed to write about it. But if you're interested in this topic, there's a number of books she did, a number of tapes, and again, they're in German, they're in Spanish, they're in many languages, and in several countries, these are her bestsellers. So On Death and Dying. So it's the 50th anniversary of On Death and Dying. The foundation's been celebrating the anniversary for the last couple months now. We've had a lot of wonderful things going on. There's a new edition. It contains the congressional testimony Elisabeth did before Congress in August of 1972. It was the Committee on Aging, and she talked about death with dignity. It was really a huge groundbreaking presentation because not a lot of people talked about death with the government before. Also, I want to point out that, you know, people always frame On Death and Dying as something, a book about the stages, but really Elisabeth said, you know, look at this, what the dying have to teach doctors, nurses, clergy, and their own family. You know, that's really important because half the book is just stories about patients and patients being our teachers. So Elisabeth said the book is about so much more than the stages. The book, for example, was the launching point for the hospice movement, palliative care movement, and for the thanatology movement. So note, I'm saying it's the launching point for the movement. I'm not saying that Elisabeth created thanatology. She did not. I think that word was created in 1905 or 1906. Balfour Mount kind of came up with the term palliative and was, I guess, the father of palliative care. And of course, Dame Cicely Saunders began the first modern hospice. But what Elisabeth did is once the book came out, she went out and she lectured to 5,000 and 10,000 people a week. And that's how the movement began. If you're talking to 5,000 and 10,000 people a week in dozens of countries, that's where the movement began. This book also completely changed bioethics in medicine. It changed the doctor-patient relationship, and it normalized grief to some extent. So when you think about this book, really you should think about it in much broader terms than just the 5 stages. So since the book has come out, stage theory in grief has become, you know, exceedingly popular. Our friend Claire Bidwell Smith has done this book talking about anxiety as one of the missing stages. I happen to know that Elisabeth mentioned anxiety 14 times in On Death and Dying. I'm Swiss, so I know these numbers. David Kessler, her friend, just did a book on the 6th stage of grief, Finding Meaning. We have the 6 stages of grief. We have the 7 stages of grief. We have the 8 stages of grief. And Elisabeth would say, this is great, you know, because I just wrote about one model and, you know, I have no ego. You know, if 8 stages helps you, that's great. But the point of the book was to begin a conversation. And she said, you know, if you do these other books, that's great. That's part of the conversation. She had absolutely no problem with that. So of course, people come up to me and said, wow, Ken, your mom did that one book. And I go, well, you know, she did a lot more than that one book. So let's take a look at On Death and Dying. They finally put MD on there, which I'm very excited about. Now, Amazon.com, which I think most of you know about, sells 32.8 million titles. And out of the 32.8 million titles, On Death and Dying is still ranked in the top 10,000 bestsellers out of almost 33 million. On Grief and Grieving is almost in the top 5,000 sellers. Elisabeth did 24 books in 37 languages. I think On Death and Dying is still in 27 languages. We just sold Arabic and Mongolian for the very first time, so we're very excited to see that the book is still very much alive and continuing to develop through the world. Elisabeth did this wonderful pamphlet called A Letter to a Cancer-with Child. The child's name was Dougie, and this pamphlet became the basis of the Dougie Center, which is in Portland, Oregon. I don't know if some of you know about that. And Elisabeth had so much time on her hands that she even wrote a cookbook, which is just amazing because this woman was just constantly on the road. So I don't know how she possibly had time to do this. But anyway, I definitely would love to have you look at some other books and see what Elisabeth had to say, because she had a lot to say about death and dying. For our Spanish-speaking audience today, these 11 books are currently available in Spanish. Maybe you can do a screenshot and grab a hold of these titles. And if you're interested in reading about Elisabeth from somebody else's point of view, these 10 books were written by other people about Elisabeth. This book, Quest, is a wonderful, wonderful biography of Elisabeth. This book, Tea with Elisabeth, we did right after she died. We had 51 people writing about what it was like to visit with Elisabeth, including Muhammad Ali contributed a chapter. And of course, our friend Rodrigo just did this wonderful book, which came out last year, I believe. I think it's just in Portuguese, though. So here's the 5 stages as it's commonly represented in the media. I get Google alerts, and sometimes there's as many as 8, 10, 12 different listings, and they always talk about the 5 stages, right? The 5 stages. They constantly get criticized, praised, you name it, but it's always Elisabeth and the 5 stages. So let's unveil the truth on that. So this is actually a picture of the book in the bottom left corner, and I've got it blown up here on the top right. And as you can clearly see in the book, which I'm showing you, Elisabeth talked about 10 stages. I just don't understand how in 50 years, all these grief experts have never mentioned that Elisabeth wrote about more than 5 stages. It's just unbelievable. So we see here Elisabeth talked about shock, preparatory grief, partial denial. She talked about hope. She talked about this word I can never quite say correctly, decathesis. It means kind of letting go of the physical world. And she talked about other stages too. She talked about a total that I've identified of 13 stages, but nobody ever mentions this. And I just find it just unbelievable that all these people who claim to be all, experts on grief and on the stages of dying have never talked about this. What Elisabeth said, again, is that the 5 stages are a very simplified version of what people go through. She goes, I don't mean that people only have 5 stages, but these are 5 principal stages that people go through. But sometimes they don't go through any of them. Sometimes they go through multiple ones. Sometimes there's no stages. But I really want to point out that in On Death and Dying, Elisabeth clearly talks about 10 stages, and she talks about other things. She talks about jealousy, anxiety, other things too. So obviously, she realized that grief is a complicated thing. So just so you keep in mind that the 5 stages are just kind of a very simplified form, just so that people who are not in the medical industry can remember them and use them as a tool. Here is another chart from the foundation describing what Elisabeth was talking about. And I just want to emphasize that the stages are flexible, right? They go round and round. Hope was, if you look at the last chart, hope was the biggest stage. And yet other authors have written books saying, well, Elizabeth didn't realize that hope was one of the stages. So like, yeah, she clearly did, obviously. Here's another chart that Elisabeth did in the late 70s. Again, you know, I mean, she said this 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, but she said, look, you know, the 5 stages are not linear, right? Let me show you a different way that you could think about the stages. So, and here we include dreams. So I just show you that the stages are flexible, and Elisabeth was flexible, and they're not meant to be some kind of progressive thing. Unfortunately, people kind of use the stages as predictive when they're really more descriptive. So this is a tape that came out in 1972, and I want to play you a little cut from the tape, and I just want you to hear what Elisabeth says about the stages, because also people misrepresent the stages to say that Elisabeth never meant for the stages to be applied to families or nurses or other people. She only said they were applying to dying people. So let's listen. Comes in about 20 seconds into the audio, what Elisabeth has to say about the stages.
We are presenting here a collection of tapes, including the lessons we learned from dying patients, whom we asked explicitly to be our teachers. The first part contains some of the highlights of what these patients taught us meaning the members of the helping profession. It will describe the stages the patients and their families will go through from the beginning of a potentially terminal illness to their actual death.
Okay, so the patients and their families. Elisabeth clearly said this on tape in 72. She said it many other places, but I just wanted to show you one example. And here's some quotes from her second book from 1974. You see here on the right side, patients do not necessarily follow a classical pattern from the stage of denial. She also said in the same paragraph, most of my patients have exhibited 2 or 3 stages simultaneously. So again, you know, everything you see in the media is often wrong. And hopefully between myself and the foundation, we can clarify this for people. Also on the right side, Elisabeth said, please tie in the stages of dying with the loss of sight. So Elisabeth is clearly saying that the stages apply to all loss and change, something that's again misrepresented. So I went on Google last week, and I just pulled off, I think, let's see, 1, 2, 4 of the top criticisms of the stages. And you see in each and every one, and I have the Spanish translation here, you know, almost all of the criticisms are their fixed sequence, smooth and predictable path, proper order, no stages of grief. Well, as I've just shown you, you know, Elisabeth said the stages are fluid. Some people go through no stages. The stages are not linear. Elisabeth said this like every week of her life, but for some reason, the media and other grief experts have kind of clung on to this idea that the stages are linear. And so hopefully we can get past this on this presentation that that is not correct. Down here from her book On Grief and Grieving with David Kessler, she wrote, everyone's grief is unique. They are not stops on a linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or goes through them in a prescribed order. So in the last 50 years, it's been amazing to watch. The 5 stages have taken on a life of their own. It's really pretty amazing. So here we have a novel in Spanish, I believe. Here we have, oh no, here's a movie. This is a novel. This is a book of poetry, My 5 Stages of Grief, the poetry anthology. We have cartoons. We have My Mother as a Japanese cartoon. The 5 stages with the Avengers. They talked about the 5 stages in Deadpool 2. And the 5 stages are just everywhere. It's become extremely popular as a part of popular culture and media. Here is a list of musicians that have named albums or songs after Elisabeth or the stages. Just want to point out a few of these. This song was quite strange for her son to hear. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross has died. It's a rock song. In this song by a Scottish band, they actually used Elisabeth's voice 3 times in the song. It's very unusual. I talked to the singer of the band, and he said he was expressing his grief about his mother dying. In this album here, this saxophone player in Japan was so inspired by Elisabeth's autobiography that he named his album Wheel of Life. The Dixie Chicks, apparently their Gaslighter album, which just came out, is based on the stages. And there's 2 rock bands named after my mother called Kubler-Ross. There's a Kubler-Ross rock band in Scotland and a Kubler-Ross rock band in Sweden. I know the second one was started by a nurse. Here are the 5 stages that I've seen being used in popular television and movies. And again, these are just shows I've seen in the United States. You can imagine it's been in hundreds and hundreds of shows around the world. I'm now going to show you a clip from, which movie is it? The Bucket List. So let's take a look at the 5 stages in the bucket list.
Stage 1. What? 5 stages. Denial, anger, mourning, depression, acceptance. No, of course, you're not thinking of suicide. You're in stage 1. Denial. What stage are you in? Denial.
The 5 stages have also been used in plays, in cartoons, in gaming. They're just everywhere. And from the 5 stages, in the last 20 years, the 5 stages have now become the Kubler-Ross change curve or the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. A lot of major companies around the world use the Kubler-Ross change curve to train workers and employees on loss and change in the workplace. I know they're being used by IBM, Boeing, Microsoft, who else? The BBC uses it to train their employees. We have people contacting us several times a week to get permission to use the Kubler-Ross change curve. My mother did know about it. People started approaching her towards the end of her life to ask her about it. And she said, again, yeah, you know, that's great. It's not really what I was thinking of 50 years ago, but, you know, it seems appropriate. So she had no problem with it. Here's some more samples, how the 5 stages have been adopted. This was an article on the Korean economy. You can see it's sourcing Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. And here's an article on the legal system of Wisconsin, leading and managing change, the resistance curve. That's another name adopted from Kubler-Ross. And from there, it's just kept on going. Here we have the 22 stages of grief, the roller coaster of change, the SARA model, and dealing with loss. So the change curve continues to change. So it's just amazing. I'm excited to see what happens in the next 30 years. Okay, so very important today. I'd like to share with you that Elisabeth did a lot more than the 5 stages. One of her ideas that was very, very important in her work was the 4 quadrants. Basically, she said, if you're dealing with patients or anyone who's in a position where they're having pain, suffering, loss, you really have to treat the patient in 4 quadrants: the physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. She said somebody cannot be completely healed unless you deal with all 4 quadrants. And I think this is taken from Jung, isn't it, Rodrigo? Yeah. Yeah, a lot of her ideas were kind of based on things she had heard from Jung and read from Jung. So I have another short video of Elisabeth talking about the 4 stages, the 4 quadrants rather. And I want you to note how funny my mother is. She is always a little sassy, even though she was the death and dying lady. She was really the life and living lady. And a lot of people thought she must be very serious because she'd worked with death so much, but she really had a great sense of humor, was very relaxed, and She was always enjoying herself no matter what she was doing. But here's Elisabeth talking about the four quadrants.
Human beings, in my opinion, and that's just one model, consist of four quadrants. You can hear it if you don't see it. The physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual. All human beings consist of the same. Some of them like to deny it, but that's their problem. When you work with dying patients, and I started originally only with grown-ups, only later when I had children of my own, when I had a boy and a girl, I realized that I'm shying away from dying children because every dying child, every dying boy reminded me of my boy, every dying girl reminded me of my girl, and I knew that I had to do something about it. And then I moved to be the children's hospital, where there were mainly dying children, and I saw the children are much easier, much less phonicalonist, much more honest, and they're wonderful to talk to, and they're terrific teachers. And I often say there are only three kinds of honest people left in the world. One of them are psychotics. The others are dying patients who have very little time left, so they throw overboard all the baloney. And the other one are young children before we contaminate them. So if you really want good teachers for your own life, work with psychotics or children of dying patients. And they're wonderful, and they give you more than you give them. And I mean that literally. So very briefly, if you work with dying patients, and this is a general rule of thumb, you always start with the physical quadrant. When you start growing up a family and you have a newborn baby, you only take care of the physical needs the first year of life. That is priority one at the beginning of life and again at the end of life. You take care of the physical quadrant, babies who are loved, hugged, touched, smooched, held, rocked. You give them the foundation of life. They should have physical contact in the whole first year of life as much as humanly possible. And some of you know Renee Spitz's book on the first year of life, and you know what happens when babies are never touched and loved. They may have nurses around the clock, and they may have all the right formulas, and they die like flies because they don't have that physical, loving, hugging touch. Same thing with terminally ill people, they need to be hugged and touched.
Elisabeth was always criticized, especially in the early days, because she had her own style of working with dying patients. And back in the 60s and 70s, a doctor did not get into bed with a dying patient. But my mother she sat in the bed with the patient, and she was always touching them, stroking their arm. And she couldn't understand why doctors are taught not to get emotionally involved. She thought that was just a horrible way of doing things. And so she was always kind of swimming upstream with the medical community, but she was very successful. And gradually, people began to take this on, although it's still a bit of a struggle because it's definitely not taught in medical school to sit in bed with your patient. So, as I said, the 5 stages are not linear, and my mother was always coming back to circles and wheels. She said everything in life is a circle or a wheel. We die, we born, day, night, the seasons, the 4 quadrants. A lot of Elisabeth's work is based around this idea that things are wheels. Even her autobiography, The Wheel of Life, she's talking about that. Here in the early 70s, while she's developing the 4 quadrants theory, you see it's slightly different here, but this was when she just opened up her work in California in Escondido at Shanti-Nilaya. But, if you look at Elisabeth's work in depth and go through all of her books, you'll see this kind of idea of circles and wheels going throughout a lot of Elisabeth's work. This is taken from the Dougie letter, by the way, which is available in Spanish and Italian, Greek, I think it's in Portuguese. Is that right, Rodrigo? Yeah, it's in many languages, and I definitely recommend it. It was that 16-page booklet that Elisabeth wrote to her young patient, Dougie, who was dying of cancer. So another one of my mother's techniques was drawing interpretation. Elisabeth had a young man who was about 18 come to the house, and they started talking. Elisabeth just felt a deep connection with this person, so she sponsored him through college, and he ended up being one of her partners for the rest of her life. And this man, Greg Firth, did this wonderful book, The Secret World of Drawings. And Elisabeth really got into it because she started working with dying children quite a lot for a while. And she just found it as a wonderful tool to really get to know the psyche of dying people. And so she really emphasized that everyone working with dying patients should always get into drawing interpretation. There's other great books by other authors, of course, like Susan Bach and others. But I recommend this book. I'm a little bit biased. But it's just a wonderful tool. And my mother often had me make drawings, and I didn't realize why until much later in life. But I was being psychoanalyzed repeatedly. So we have another short video here of my mother talking about listening. So let's listen to that.
When I started this work, I was
Can turn on your audio, please? No, on Zoom.
never done anything except sit with people and listen to them and hear them.
So let's go back to that for a moment. So Elisabeth always said, my book on death and dying is not about the stages. It's about listening. It's about unconditional love. It's about rehumanizing medicine and patient care. It's about bioethics. It's about the doctor-patient relationship. But listening was key. Elisabeth had this incredible ability to hear things that most people couldn't hear. One of my favorite stories, and I heard this from a priest, so I got to believe it's true. This priest was a friend of our family's, and I went to visit him shortly before he died just a few years ago. And he said, one of the most amazing things I ever saw your mother do was we were doing rounds with dying patients, and we walked into a room of a woman who was dying of cancer of the throat and jaw. And this woman had her mouth completely wired shut. She couldn't utter a single word, but he said, your mother sat down and seemed to have an entire conversation with this woman, even though she couldn't utter a single word. And your mother would answer this woman, she would grunt, your mother would answer, and it was just very confusing. And then your mother turned to me and said, get this woman an apple, and left the room without any explanation. So the priest thought this was very strange. Why would I get a woman whose mouth is wired shut an apple? It doesn't make sense. But he said, you know, your mother was very famous, and I didn't want to argue with her. So I went down to the cafeteria, I got an apple, and when I gave it to the woman, she started crying. And he said, I asked the woman, you know, can I get a pencil and paper? Can you write down what just transpired between you and Elisabeth? I really have to know. And so she wrote down that she had been a school teacher and she just wanted to get one more apple like she used to get from her students. You know, so how did Elisabeth know this? It wasn't written on a chart. The woman couldn't utter a word. And Elisabeth just had this capacity to listen like this all the time. I mean, I saw it every single week. She did it with me, and she did it with her friends, and everywhere she went, she just had this capacity to kind of pull things out of the air. And I have no idea how she did it, but she said, we all have this capacity if we can just learn to listen, not with our ears, but with our heart and with our soul. As I mentioned, Elisabeth did many, many things that had nothing to do with the 5 stages or on death and dying. Elisabeth said, so many people are afraid to die because they haven't lived fully. She said, if I can intercede and if I can get them to kind of release all their pent up anger and pain and frustrations and whatever's keeping them from living fully, then they'll never be afraid to die. And so she developed this wonderful workshop called the Life, Death, and Transition Workshop. And it was a externalization technique for people to deal with their unfinished business, is what she called it. 2 of the workshop leaders, Jacob Watson, is going to be speaking in a few weeks, and Larry Lincoln did books on the workshops. And if you'd like more information, unfortunately just in English, you can go to this website, and all the former staff leaders of the workshops still give workshops. And I think there's 60 or 70 different people still doing workshops, and they still do them in Japan. And I think they still do them in Europe. And I think we're going to begin doing them in South America again soon. But on the next slide, I have another video of my mom. Oh, no, sorry. This one's of Larry. And this is Larry Lincoln. He was the head of all the staff of the workshops. He's speaking at my mom's funeral. And for our translators, I changed the video to the one I sent you last night, by the way. So anyway, this is Larry Lincoln talking about what happened at the workshops and why they were so important in Elisabeth's legacy.
Attended a workshop 15 years ago, and he'd come up to me and say, I attended this workshop and it changed my life. They don't say, you know, it was a very nice workshop. They say, it changed my life. I took a right turn after that workshop, and life has been different ever since. At these workshops, those of you who've attended the workshops, you know that it was a safe place for us to do our work, to find out what it is that was preventing us from living full lives and preventing us from being who we really are. We could analyze exactly why these workshops work the way they work. The safe place, the group process, the place to let out the rage and the fear, the fact that Elisabeth demystified the grief work. But the whole was much greater than the sum of its parts. It wasn't just about that. And so I don't think that I can break it down for anybody. It was a reverent place that Elisabeth created. It was a place for divine manipulation. It was a place for, at one workshop, there were 92 or 3 participants, including a 16-year-old who was shipped off by a desperate mother because he tried to commit suicide 3 or 4 times. And he said he was going to complete it the next time. And in the introductions, we would go around and stand up and say our name and say why we were here, and then sit down and touch the next person. And he stood up and basically said that. He said he was doing this for his mother's sake. And sat down and reached over and touched the next person next to him. And a 45-year-old man stood up and said, 4 weeks ago, my 16-year-old son committed suicide. And for that week, that young man got to see the consequences of that kind of action, and that father was able to be a father one more time for 5 days.
That kind of magic happened all the time at the workshops. Again, Elisabeth was just totally tuned in with everybody. Okay, countertransference and unfinished business. Elisabeth realized very quickly that one of the greatest problems that she saw in the hospitals was that doctors come in to tell dying patients that they're dying, and unfortunately, they haven't dealt with their own unfinished business. And so you have doctors who are completely full of fear and have no idea how to talk about death, talking to dying people. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of transference, a lot of countertransference, because they're both approaching this conversation with fear. Elisabeth said, you know, this is nonsense. You can't possibly have doctors telling patients, you know, this news if they haven't dealt with their own unfinished business. So she said, please, you know, train doctors to deal with their own unfinished business, their own fears, their own stigmas. Otherwise, they can't possibly be good at breaking the news to patients. So this was also a very important thing that she tried to deal with in the workshops. Symbolic verbal and nonverbal language. This was also very important in Elisabeth's work. Again, you know, Elisabeth was tuned in on every different front to the patient. She was just kind of feeling them out, trying to understand what they were going through, what kind of stage of, you know, their psychological being, and how to approach them from a healthy point that they could, you know, are they ready to have the conversation? Are they not ready to have the conversation? Do I break it slowly? How do I do it? And so I've got one more video here of Elisabeth talking about symbolic verbal and nonverbal language.
Important that we teach that there is not only, the common language that we are familiar with, but that there is also symbolical language and a non-verbal language. For teaching purposes, we put it together into 3 languages that young patients use when they try to convey to you their own awareness of their impending death. The simplest language is plain English. If an old woman says to you, I know I have cancer and I'm not getting out of this hospital anymore, everybody knows what she's talking about, that she talks about her dying. Those patients are understood by anybody, lay people and professionals.
Ken, please, you need to turn on to turn off your audio and share the computer's audio in the middle of the screen. We cannot hear you anymore. In the middle of the screen, Zoom, you can share the computer's audio.
Important that we teach that there is not only, the common language that we are familiar with, but that there is also a symbolical language and a non-verbal language. For teaching purposes, we put it together into 3 languages that young patients use when they try to convey to you their own awareness of their impending death. The simplest language is plain English. If an old woman says to you, I know I have cancer and I'm not getting out of this hospital anymore, everybody knows what she's talking about, that she talks about her dying. Those patients are understood by anybody, lay people and professional people, but those are the patients who need you the least, because anybody who can talk about their own impending death in plain English is usually has come to grips with their own finiteness and is usually at least partially at peace with their own death. And that means that they end up helping you more than the other way around. Their own death. Or old people who are petrified to die. All these patients who need us terribly much use a symbolical language. And there are 2 kinds of symbolical languages. One is a symbolical non-verbal language that is used almost exclusively by young children between the ages of 3 and 10, and a symbolical verbal language which is used by older children, adolescents, and grown-ups.
I think I'll give you some samples myself. Elisabeth talked about an old man she used to see in the hospital every day, and he would use his walker, and every day, no matter where he went, he had that walker, and she saw him for weeks and weeks and weeks, and the walker was always with him. One day, the old man came up to her, and gave her the walker, and she didn't understand this because he needed the walker to get around, and he just gave her the walker without a single word and turned around and went back into his room. And the very next day, the man died. And Elisabeth realized this was a classic sample of nonverbal symbolic language. Another sample of that was there was a young boy who was running around the hospital kind of shooting girls with his finger, like pretending like he had a gun. And he was very disruptive, and the staff didn't know what to do with him. They sent him to a psychiatrist and different workers, and nobody could get him to settle down. And so they called Elisabeth, and of course, she went up and had him make a drawing and talk to him like an adult. And finally he said, I'm not angry at the girls. I don't want to shoot them, but if I don't get a new kidney, I'm going to die. And maybe if one of these girls dies, I can get one of their kidneys. And so this is another classic example of symbolic nonverbal language, this little boy running around pretending to shoot girls. So very important Elizabeth's work, and she really emphasized that anyone working with dying patients has to understand how to use symbolic, verbal, and nonverbal language in their work. Another very important lesson in Elizabeth's life was visiting the concentration camps in 1947. Elizabeth went around Europe for 2 years rebuilding war-torn villages. She ended up in Poland at this concentration camp, and she met a young girl who had been interned in the camp, and she was being pushed into the ovens to be gassed to death with her whole family, and her whole family was right ahead of her. And when she got to the door, the oven was filled up and they closed the door right in front of her face, and she heard her entire family being murdered. And she had been kind of wandering around for 2 years deciding what to do with her life. And Elizabeth said, "You must be very angry at the Germans. Like, what are you going to do with your life now?" She goes, "Well, actually, I'm going to go help rebuild German villages." And Elizabeth was just, dumbfounded. She couldn't imagine that this girl who had seen her family murdered right in front of her would want to go help the Germans. But she said, if I fill my heart with hatred and anger, then I'm no better than the Nazis. I'm going to use this as an example of using this terrible experience to go do something good. And from that, Elizabeth realized that no matter what the situation, no matter what's happened to you, you can take any situation and you can become a Mother Teresa or a Hitler. But it's up to you to decide what your perspective is and what lessons you can learn from anything that happens to you. In the barracks where the children were put before they were killed, they often drew butterflies in the walls with their fingernails. And again, it took Elizabeth years of thinking about this, but she realized that the children knew that their souls would float above their bodies after they die. And so this became a very important symbol to my mother. And when she began her work starting the hospice movement, she used the butterfly as a symbol for this transformation. And I think that's why you see the butterfly used today in hospice, because of this thing that she saw in 1947 in Majdanek. There's a book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly about these drawings. Elizabeth, of course, having this experience at the concentration camp, was a big fan of Viktor Frankl and logotherapy. She loved Viktor. They were friends towards the end of their lives. And a very important part of my mother's work is very similar to logotherapy, finding meaning, which my mother said is, finding perspective or learning lessons from all these tough situations in life. And last on this part of the presentation, I just wanted to share with you that as part of the 50th anniversary, the American Journal of Bioethics did an entire issue devoted to On Death and Dying. I was really happy to see this because out of, I can't remember how many articles there are, there's maybe 25, 30 articles. Not a single article discusses the 5 stages. So imagine this entire journal is about On Death and Dying, and they don't talk about the 5 stages. This is just, another important sample of saying that the book is about so many other things than stages. If you just take a moment to read the titles, and if our translators can translate the titles, I'll give you a few seconds here to translate those. Okay, now we're going to start a different chapter of the presentation. My journey with Elisabeth, my mom. For the first 9 years of my life, Elisabeth was a normal mom. I mean, normal enough. She was a little eccentric, but that was fun. But, we just, she loved to cook. We used to make candles. We went berry picking, just usual things. Even though she was busy at the hospital, she was just a normal mom. And in 1969, when the book came out, I remember the phone started ringing all day long. We put in a second phone line. We decided to put a secretary on the back porch. This is our house, by the way, in Chicago. So first we had one secretary, then we had 2 secretaries. the mail started coming in bigger bags, then boxes. Then the mailman started coming twice a day. And then my mom was off. She started lecturing first around America and then around the world. So the only way I got to see my mother was traveling around the world with her. So, you know, I didn't get to spend a lot of time growing up with my mother after I was 9 years old, but there was amazing quality because anywhere in the world she went, I got to travel with her. So I ended up going to 19 countries with her on 6 different continents. And of course, I would sneak in and watch her lecture, even though I was instructed not to. And it was just amazing to see my mom sell out, you know, the Sydney Town Hall every night, or all these huge places with 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 people a night. And I used to love, even more than listening to my mother, was to go outside and listen to the people talk about my mother after the presentation, because it was like hearing them speak about another person. And if you can imagine, you know, both my parents were doctors, and my father was a neuropathologist. So he was bringing home human brains to leave in the kitchen every night, you know, because he'd have to go to a different hospital next day. So I grew up hearing about death, death, death every night at the dinner table. And of course, my mother believed in life after death. And of course, my father, with kind of a Jewish Eastern European background, did not believe in life after death. And so they were constantly politely butting heads about whether there's life after death, talking about the brain, talking about diseases. My mother was bringing home dying people, sometimes my age, who were 8, 10, 12, 14 years old. And I grew up around a lot of death. And so I thought about life and what's this life going to be like for me? And I thought, wow, Lord, life is short and precarious. I got to do something really fun. So I decided to be a travel photographer. My father had these National Geographics, and I thought, what could be more fun than traveling around the world and meeting indigenous people and hanging out of helicopters and seeing all the different cultures of the world? That's got to be like one of the most wonderful ways you could spend your life. So that's what I did. My goal was to photograph 101 countries. And I'm at 100 countries right now. COVID has kind of stopped me from crossing the finish line. But I got to hang out of helicopters and nightclub in Beirut. I've got to meet tribal people. As you see up here, this was the chief of the tribe in Papua New Guinea. This is our friend Alicia, who's in Mexico. She runs the EKR Mexico North. And Lourdes, who's on the call today. I did the most difficult rafting trip in the world on the Zambezi. And then of course we flipped. And these are some of the photographs I've taken over the last 30, 35 years. I think you can see clearly, you know, these photographs are kind of like drawings for my mother. They really express who I am. I see life as a very colorful, interesting, graphic, fascinating place, just because I was exposed to so much death as a child. I'm constantly thinking about, you know, the last day of my life. I want to look back, and I want to look back on a life that's been just so full. It's just bursting, this amazing photo album. And, you know, I'm always thinking that life is finite and I don't want to waste time. So, you know, it doesn't mean I can't relax, but, you know, I'm trying to challenge my fears, live my life love-based, which is what Elisabeth taught, and really go out and have an amazing, interesting life and take some challenges and make some mistakes. Because if you're not making mistakes, I don't think you're living fully. But these photographs totally express how I feel about being alive. It's just very colorful, graphic, and just an engaging place to be in. And I just choose to see the light in the world. So let's go back to the family. This is the last photograph taken of my family together. My parents had split up in the 70s because my mom was always off traveling. And my father said something very unusual to my sister when she was about 6 years old. He said, "I'm going to send you flowers on the first snowfall after you die." So every couple of years, my sister and I would look at each other and say, why are our parents so weird? Why are they so focused on death? You know, what a strange thing for our father to say when he doesn't believe in life after death. Why is he going to send you flowers after he dies? It doesn't even make sense. So about 25 years later, I'm living here in Arizona. and I'd come to spend some time with my father because he had a bad heart. He was a snowbird living here just in the winters from Chicago. And my father said, please send Barbara some flowers for her birthday tomorrow. It's her birthday. And this is before the internet. So I went out and I sent Barbara a dozen roses. And when I came home, my father had died in his afternoon nap. So the next day, my sister living in Seattle, which is not a big snow city, I think, came home and there was a dozen roses on her front doorstep in the snow. So my mother was like, I told you so. So my mother loved it that she had the last word on this. And then further to that, the next winter in northern Wisconsin, my sister had roses blooming in the snow in her driveway. So my mother again said, see, I told your father, he didn't believe me. Now he knows. So my mother eventually moved to Virginia because she said it reminded her of Switzerland. And she had a tough time with the locals because they didn't really understand what she was doing. They thought, wow, this woman is like talking to dead people, or we don't understand what she's doing, but she's bringing in a lot of business. So, I guess we don't care. But then the AIDS crisis hit and there was a lot of babies being abandoned at hospitals. And my mother was just disgusted. Like, as she said in that video, babies need to have touch and human love and be a part of a family. And being abandoned at a hospital was just horrible for them. So she was going to start an AIDS hospice for babies in rural Virginia. Well, the locals didn't like that. They had a town meeting, then they had a county meeting, and nearly the entire county showed up and said, we're not going to allow that. And Elisabeth said, I don't care. And so she had to have a police escort home. She started getting death threats. They started shooting bullets through windows. People with shotguns would hang out in front of her farm. And Elisabeth wouldn't back down. She would never back down when she knew she was doing the right thing. So she went off to lecture in Baltimore for one day, and this is what happened to her house. So not only was there a fire, but they shot her favorite llama. In the weeks before, there had been a lot of break-ins to her home and office. They stole a lot of things. And so things were just out of control. And so, I flew there the next day, and Mom flew back from Baltimore. And the next day, my mother had a small stroke, a TIA. And in the middle of the stroke, if you can imagine, Elisabeth is saying, Kenneth, get me a cigarette. And I'm trying to get her into the hospital. And she's like, they'll kill me. Hospitals are terrible places. So she wouldn't go to the hospital and she just wanted to smoke and kind of think about what happened. So I was terrified they were going to shoot her, and she didn't care. She was already saying within 2 or 3 days, she's going to rebuild a farm. She's going to build a hospice. No one's going to stop her. Well, as her son, I couldn't allow that to happen. So I had to trick her into going to a larger city. So I said, why don't we get out of here and just go shopping because you don't have any clothes now? And she said, yeah, that's okay. And then I said, after a few days, well, why don't we go down to Arizona because it'll be, at least 6 weeks before you get any insurance money. And so she said, yeah, that's okay. So I came down to Arizona with my mom and I waited a few days and I already had some houses picked out. And I said, Mom, why don't we go shopping for a little vacation house, to something you can escape to in the winter. And so we looked at a couple houses, and the second house we looked at, I didn't even walk in the door. I knew it was the right house. And within 5 minutes, she said, Kenneth, I want this house. And I thought, wow, that's great. I'm going to get my life back as a photographer. I'm just going to do my normal thing. Elisabeth will live her own life. But that's not what happened. Something strange happened. Right before the fire, I had gone to visit Mom on the farm, and I had asked to borrow a photograph. And she said, well, I made you a lot of cakes and pies, so why don't I send you the photograph in the mail? And a week later, I got every single one of her photo albums. And so when the fire happened, we saved every single photograph she had. That's why I'm able to show you photographs today from my mom's life. And then even stranger, 15 years later in the mail, I get a box with this little book in it. And I open it up, and it's my mother's diary from 1960. And there was a little note attached to it. And my mom's former secretary had been digging in the ashes 15 years later just kind of taking a trip down memory lane, and she noticed her safe from the second floor had fallen into the basement. So this woman, Frances, had the safe brought up. She had it cracked open, and in the back corner, because it fell into the corner of the foundation where there wasn't fire on two sides of the safe, she found several things which hadn't burned, including my mom's diary from 1960. So an incredible gift. And as my mother would say, there's never any accidents. You know, everything is divine manipulation. So coming back to Arizona, within a very short time, I had 18 boxes of mail from dying people in my living room. And I was certainly not equipped to deal with it. On top of that, my mother had a full-blown stroke a few months later, and now she was paralyzed on her left side. So it became a very challenging time for the last 9 years of her life. And I just found it ironic that for the first 9 years of my life, she took care of me. And then for the last 9 years of my life, I took care of her. It was kind of poetic in some ways. But my mom was paralyzed. She had chronic pain syndrome, so you couldn't hug her. So she always had her little ET finger, we called it, out so she could touch people so they wouldn't hug her. So here's my mom getting a little shampoo in the backyard with her sister Erica. And every single week, it was like a soap opera because people from around the world were constantly visiting Elisabeth. And I didn't know who most of these people were. And people would show up and say, oh, your mother promised me $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 because I'm her friend, or I made a garden or whatever. And so it became like the circus. My mother used to have 13 to 16 people handling her affairs, and then it was me. And so it was very, very stressful. And it got so stressful that I had a heart attack at 42 years old. I had a heart attack on an airplane going into Hermosillo, Mexico. And we landed, I was looking for my friend, I was staggering around, I passed out, and I woke up and I was at the airport ambulance station laying on the ground. And I remember seeing some guys running over to me, and I had this terrible pain in my chest. And the only thing I could think of was, oh my God, my poor sister has to deal with all my mom's business. I can't believe it. So I really feel like that alone proves that I really learned my mother's lessons, because I was certain I was going to die. I was in terrible pain. I was in a small town in Mexico, which I was certain did not have proper medical care. And all I could think of was, oh my God, poor Barbara. So I think I'm cured of this fear of death. So a lot of papers have written about Elisabeth being very angry at the end of her life. She discarded all her beliefs about death and dying and the stages and all that nonsense. And so again, I just want to show you that, you know, you unfortunately cannot believe what you read. And I want to show you a little clip of Oprah talking to my mom. Oprah had heard that my mother was dying and she wanted to come down and do one last interview. They'd done a number of interviews over the years. And so even though my mother was angry about being paralyzed, she was still very full of life. She certainly, you know, didn't change her philosophy on life and death and dying patients and the stages and so forth. But I just want to give you a sense of Elisabeth kind of towards the end of her life. And we just had this little transcription come in this morning. So I'm glad, hopefully you'll be able to understand my mother. She's had a stroke, and between that and a Swiss accent, she's a little hard to understand sometimes. But hopefully both you and the translators can get an idea of what she's saying here, okay? So let's take a look at Elisabeth. Oh, and again, Elisabeth says, you know, she's done her last book, but, you know, she was such a workaholic that she ended up doing 3 more books after this supposedly last book on her life, The Wheel of Life. So let's take a look here.
Arizona to talk to Elisabeth again.
Great to see you after all these years. Do you remember?
You have the big afro.
A big
That's all
afro.
I remember.
Big afro.
Elisabeth says she's ready to die, but she's not going gently. She's as feisty and opinionated as ever. And from this Swiss country doctor's lifelong research on death and dying, we can all take away lessons about living and the wheel of life.
Elisabeth Kübler-Ross has written a new book, her last, called The Wheel of Life. It is an autobiography, and during our recent visit, I asked her to talk about how she feels now that she is reaching the end of her life. Tell us exactly what it is you have and what has caused this
I had
debilitation.
a stroke on Mother's Day.
What year?
2.5 years ago.
2.5 years ago.
And I've been paralyzed on the left side. And then I had a frozen shoulder, and then I got kidney stones, then I broke my hip, one thing after another. And I was sitting in a chair 15 hours a day like a zombie, not able to do anything.
When you were 15 hours a day in the chair, were you hoping for your own death?
Oh, every day, every minute. And I couldn't stand it.
So are you in the process now, or do you think you are you fighting to live, or are you willing?
There are days when I'm up to here and don't want to any part of it, and there are days when I think maybe it's worthwhile.
Did you go through those stages yourself of denial?
I was angry, 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 and enraged. Nothing but anger and negative.
So no denial for you?
No, are you kidding?
No.
No denial.
Just
no
angry.
Bargaining.
No bargaining.
I gave God hell. I called him every name in the book in every language.
No bargaining. No depression?
No, depression came afterwards.
And then you started to accept it, or not?
Well, I'm accepting it, but I'm accepting to die would be great. But then now I have to start from scratch again. That I'm very leery about.
Starting from scratch, you mean becoming ill all over again, or?
No, to get well and to live. It's much harder when you're ready to take off. It's like you're boarded a plane and they don't take off, and you sit and wait and don't know are they going or not.
Well, when you spent your...
So I just wanted to show you a short clip of Elisabeth, you know, in the last few years that, you know, even though all the papers said she was so angry and all that, you can see Elisabeth's version of anger is, is maybe not everyone else's version of anger. So, and also I'd like to point out that Elisabeth says she sits in a chair for 15 hours a day. You know, maybe she was having a bad day. Certainly some days people didn't show up, but Elisabeth had, I think, an incredible life at the last 9 years of her life. I mean, people showed up from around the world. There would be 5 people at her front door, 10 people, 15 people. There'd be movie stars. There'd be royalty. People would be taking her out on these marathons. One day my mom was in the hospital. She'd broken her hip and she wanted to check herself out against the advice of doctors, of course. So she said, go home and get me some clothes. I'm getting out of here. I said, Mom, you really shouldn't do that. And she said, don't tell me what to do. So I go to her house up in the desert here, and there's 18 American Indians building a teepee. And I said, oh, hello, who are you? And they said, who are you? I said, no, who are you? Who are you? It's like a Seinfeld episode. So anyway, eventually we got to the point where they said, well, we're here from California and we want to honor your mother. She's a great spirit. She's a healer. And we've never given this to a non-Indian, a white person before. And I said, oh, well, we're very honored. Thank you very much. You know, I have to go bring my mom some clothes. And they said, oh, no, 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 you don't understand. This is a very big honor. You'll have to smoke the peace pipe with us. And so for 3 hours, I had to sit in her driveway smoking a peace pipe. And you can imagine after that, I was in no condition to drive. And my mother was calling me every 10, 15, 20 minutes. Kenneth, where are you? What are you doing? What do you mean you're smoking a pipe in my driveway? So, I mean, every single week, it was like some kind of crazy soap opera. You know, crazy people showed up, llamas showed up, sacred people, indigenous people, all sorts of people showed up wanting everything under the sun. And I was trying to I was like the air traffic controller, trying to regulate people so they weren't kind of stacked up together and they had some quality time with Elisabeth. But it was pretty crazy. After the 9/11 attacks, Time magazine asked Elisabeth to come to New York and take a look at the World Trade Center. So that was the first time she flew after her stroke. That was quite challenging. Up here in the upper right, you see we're in the American Express building, right next to the 9/11 disaster site. It had just been a few weeks. It was still smoking to some extent. And it was great for Elisabeth to get out, even though it was a terrible time. And Elisabeth began to realize that, you know, she could still participate and still had things to contribute to society. Down here, we have Muhammad Ali with my mom. My mom was just constantly having these amazing visitors at her house and still complaining that she was bored. So she was a handful at the end, let me tell you. But we both had a lot of fun, but we certainly had a lot of challenging times too. Mom was a big fan of E.T. She said E.T. Kind of embodies my message of unconditional love. So this is my mom on Halloween dressed up like E.T. And this is her grandchild, Sylvia. Sylvia is now studying pediatric oncology. My mom was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame several years after she died. So Sylvia here and Emma, her younger sister, who were 5 and 7, I think at the time, ended up being the youngest acceptees in the history of the Women's Hall of Fame. They went up on stage in front of 800 people and did an acceptance speech on behalf of their grandmother. It's really amazing to watch. This is my mom with her triplet sisters. Let's see, that was on their 75th birthday. People don't realize it, but you know, my mom was a triplet. And so, you know, she became famous in 1969 with her book. But even back in 1926, 27, 28, she was very famous in Switzerland because she was a triplet. And so they used to be in posters, in parades, in advertisements, advertising clothes, skiing, you name it. So my mother had 2 bouts of fame, and she really didn't love either of those bouts of fame, but she put up with it. So her sister Erica died a few months after this picture. Erica was amazing. She was the first female senator in the history of Switzerland. And her sister Ava here just died back in December at 93. Ava, in her 80s, was cross-country skiing. She was feeding homeless kids in Kathmandu. She went across Africa. She went across Australia. This woman was like nonstop. She was going to India on vacation for a month at a time in her 80s. I mean, it's just incredible. So all of the Kublers have this amazing gene. It's part gypsy and part rebel and part sass. And it's just been a wonderful experience to be part of this family. I want to show you my mom here towards the end of her life. We put her in a group home. They had this amazing doctor from Nicaragua who had a great sense of humor. He took great care of mom, and it was a fairly peaceful last few months of her life. She ended up getting these systemic infections, which got worse and worse, and eventually she passed. We had a 3-day party to send Elisabeth off, which was wonderful. We had a black gospel choir come down, 24 people singing and dancing on stage with Elisabeth's coffin. And it was just amazing. I know some of the people on the call today were at that funeral, like our friend Hervé from France. But, you know, we had a party. She didn't want any sadness. She didn't want any tears. We released 500 butterflies. And again, I thought I was going to get my life back, but that didn't happen. A few days later, somebody showed up from India and they wanted to meet with my mother. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. She just died." And she said, "Oh, really? I just came from Mumbai, Bombay, just to meet with your mother. I want to start a hospice." And so I thought to myself, I've got to do something, continue on my mom's legacy. So I thought I'd start a foundation, and I thought the foundation would do all the work and I'd get to still be a travel photographer, but that's not how foundations work. So I started this foundation. It started on my birthday in 2005. And for the last 15 years, we've tried to continue on with my mom's legacy. We've had a rough beginning, of course. I didn't understand foundations. They didn't understand the way I work. We had some boards we had some trouble with. But now after 15 years, I think we've got it right. I'm very excited about what we're doing. We're doing, you know, focusing on collaboration, advocacy, resources, education, support, and developing our international chapters around the world. Right now, we've got chapters in these countries: Belgium, Brazil, Chile, France, Guatemala, India, Japan. We have 2 in Mexico. Peru just opened up, and Switzerland. And in the next 2 or 3 years, we have a minimum of 5 more opening up. We're hoping there'll be more. We're already talking to somebody in Bolivia about starting a new chapter there. But here we have EKR Peru, Guatemala. Here's our friend Rodrigo talking to a dying patient with my mother's spirit between them. This was a presentation in Mexico 2 years in Monterrey. This was in Argentina with our friends Laura and Cynthia. And we're very excited with the growth of the foundation. They're just doing wonderful things, and I really applaud all of them. We've had a number of wonderful things happen to commemorate my mother's life and also the 50th anniversary. We've had a couple of streets named after my mom in Europe. They did an exhibit on Ellis Island in New York on immigrants, and the first room was devoted to Elisabeth. The National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization did a memorial to Elisabeth just in December. The BBC has just done several articles on Elisabeth, and NPR Radio here in the United States is doing an interview with me in a few weeks to do a segment on Elisabeth. The University of Chicago, finally, after 50 years, is acknowledging Elisabeth's work there, and they're going to be hanging a portrait in their largest lecture hall there. Hospice, of course, that's a big part of Elisabeth's mission. So we're very excited that the first hospice in the Netherlands was renamed after Elisabeth. She helped start this hospice. Rodrigo down in Rio is starting the Elisabeth's House in the poor slums, the favela of Rio. And our friend Eva, who's running EKR Chile, is initiating the first pediatric hospice down in Santiago, Chile. One of the things I'm most proud of is that for 25 years, I held on to all my mom's papers. I collected all her audios, her videotapes. I had 4 drawers of these videos, and I didn't know what to do with them, but I knew they needed to go to a good home, and it just made me nervous hanging on to them at my house. And so finally, I just happened to meet with a man from Stanford University, Carl Lorenz. He was in the palliative care department. We met at a movie, actually, in San Francisco, and we started a conversation, and it turned out that they were very interested in collection, and I really wanted it to go to a good home. And so we talked for about a year, and it took me a year to organize this collection. This is Maren Monson, who's with the film department and also a doctor. They ended up sending specialists from 5 different departments to view the collection, and they decided I wanted it, and I decided that I love these people, so it was a good fit. And so here's the whole collection put together, and they did this wonderful full-day seminar on Elisabeth called Reclaiming the Legacy of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Here's our friend Carl Lorenz talking about the new issue of the American Journal of Bioethics. And all these lovely people from EKR around the world showed up. We have Rodrigo and our vice president of EKR Mexico. Elisabeth was from the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Center in Virginia. This is our friend Wilka from Mexico, Diane, who's on the board, Micheline, who's our brand ambassador, Stephen Connor, and Dr. Priya from EKR India. There's 6 different libraries around the world or collections of my mother's work. Dr. Ira Byock has an exhibit in Los Angeles. Avow Hospice has a collection. Providence Trinity Care has a exhibit of some of my mom's furniture, including her original desk. This is in Palyam, India, in Kerala, India. And I just would hope you join us on some of our social media. We have Instagram in English, in Portuguese. We have 4 Spanish pages. We're on YouTube if you'd like to see some of these videos again. Some of them are translated into Spanish and Portuguese. We've got a large number of websites. We're on Pinterest, we're on LinkedIn, we're on everything except Snapchat. So that's where I draw the line. So I just want to just go over very quickly. If you just look at the words that are colorized, these are the different ideas, the elements, the themes that really define Elisabeth's work. And yes, we do have the 5 stages, but on top, we have reversing the dehumanization of patients. You know, not just dying patients, but all patients. You know, we have the Kubler-Ross change curve, the 4 quadrants, palliative care, unfinished business, externalization, countertransference, perspective, fears, unconditional love, symbolic, verbal and symbolic nonverbal language, drawing interpretation, bioethics, listening, and hope. These are all the fundamentals of what Elisabeth was about, not the 5 stages. And I leave you with this today. It's a lovely quote that Muhammad Ali contributed to our book, Tea with Elisabeth, talking about his visit with Elisabeth. So thank you very much for being with us today. I hope you enjoyed it. The other presentations will be about different things besides Elisabeth, of course, but we just thought we'd kick off the series with me talking about my experiences with Elisabeth and what I thought her work really meant to people. Next week, we have Wilka from EKR Mexico Central. I think she's talking about symbolic language of dying patients. And I hope you enjoyed our presentation today. You're certainly welcome to call me, write me. Don't be shy. I'm open to everybody. Rodrigo, any of our groups, we're here to answer questions. If you have ideas, if you want to participate, volunteer, join our board, whatever it is, we'd love you to be a part of our family here. And we're in a real wonderful period of growth. And it's been a pleasure to share my morning with you. And thank you again for getting up at strange hours all around the world. And I'm just going to pull this slide back in case you want to check out where the websites are, the Instagram page, etc. And again, there'll be wonderful speakers for the next 10 weeks. We're just going to skip Thanksgiving week as it's a holiday in the United States, but otherwise it's going to be every Thursday, same time. I hope you had no trouble with the technology here. And I'm sorry if I talk too fast for our translators. Sometimes I speak at New York speed because that's where I was born. But I hope I taught you something new about Elisabeth and gave you a new perspective on her work and on her life and what the foundation's up to these days. So thank you very much.
Thank you really much, Ken. Thank you really much, everybody. Thank you really much, Diane Gray. Thank you really much. All the board members, you are doing a wonderful job. And as a team, we can change and help everybody everywhere. So thank you really much. And you are going to receive tomorrow the class recorded, and you are going to have 2 weeks to watch again, to see again, and you can send to us questions, and we're going to be very happy to help you with everything, okay? So this link is going to be the universal link to all the online classes. So please take care of this link, okay? So use this link every Thursday. We are going to use it to have all the classes. And you are going to receive another link, a different link to the recorded classes, okay? So you need to wait. We are going to send another link. So we have a link to the online classes, and we have one link to the recorded classes, okay? So next week, we are going to have Rilka Roig. She is a Jungian certified therapist, and she works with the theoretical framework of Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, and she's going to teach about symbolic language in people close to death. So this is going to be very powerful, and we are going to have wonderful people teaching, and this is just the first course because we are going to have like 3,000 courses. So be with us, and we're going to be very happy to share everything we have. Thank you really much to everybody. And I can say, Ken, you are very Elisabeth today. And you can say to all of people, you are very Elisabeth today.
Does that mean sassy and cheeky?
Wonderful. It means beautiful.
Also, Rodrigo, can you share about our project for next year with the videos?
Oh, yes, of course. You are going, everybody, with your help, you're going to develop an online platform to educate people from every part of the globe to share all these videos, classes. So we are going to record everything, and we are going to be able to make like a Netflix about palliative care on different languages. And other things, we are developing a lot of things. And so I hope Elisabeth help us.
And we already have 200 videos, not just by Elisabeth, by a lot of leaders in the field. So we're going to be having a lot of different viewpoints because we want everyone's voice to be heard.
Yes, of course. Yes, exactly. As always. Okay, everyone. So you are very Elisabeth today. Thank you really much for everything. And I hope all the light and love, and everything inside you can help you and guide you everywhere. So thank you really much.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. See you next week.
Ciao.
You are very Elisabeth today. Bye-bye.